All right, so let's see if we can make sense of these slopes. So if you remember, the slope is equal to the rise over the run, right? And so in our case, the rise is going to be the change in GDP divided by the change in L, or the change in H in this case, if we want to think of it in that way. So we could think of the change in H, right? So that's the slope of my production function. So let's calculate that. From L equal to 16 to L equal to 25. Change in Y over the change in H. Change in Y is 100 minus 80. Change in H, 25 minus 16. So that would be 20 over 9, and that turns out to be 2.22 repeating, right? So if I think of the interpretation there, what it says is that for each unit increase in L or H, my GDP is going to go up by 2.22 units in that interval. Now, what happens when L is a little bit higher? From L equal to 25 to L equal to 36, the slope, the change in Y over the change in H, or L in this case, because little h is 1, they're the same, is 120 minus 100 over 36 minus 25. So that's 20 over 11, which is about 1.82. Okay, so notice that as my labor or efficiency units of labor is increasing, the slope, the extra output I get, is decreasing. And so we have a particular name for that phenomenon. So what we've just calculated is actually what we call the marginal product of labor. So the marginal product of labor, which I'll typically call MPL or MPH, is equal to, I'll call it MPH since we'll stick with efficiency units of labor. Marginal product of labor is the change in Y divided by the change in H, or change in L, right? And it tells me the additional output from having one more unit of labor. That's what it tells me. Marginal product of capital is very similar. The change in Y over the change in K, and it tells me the additional output I get from having one more unit of capital. The law of diminishing marginal product says that both of those get smaller the more of the resource I have. So what this says is that, for example, the marginal product of labor gets smaller the more labor I have. It also says the marginal product of capital gets smaller the more capital I have. And the key part to this is that I'm holding the other resource fixed. And so a good way to think of this is if you own a Jimmy John's. So you've got the building, right? So you've got your capital, and the capital's fixed right now. Okay, so I have the building and all the equipment in there. And the first worker that I hire, my marginal product of labor is going to be really high. That one first worker adds a lot to my output. Output went from 0 to something positive. I add the second worker, I'm going to get some more additional output. As I keep adding workers, eventually each additional worker is going to start adding less and less to my production. Why? Because my capital is fixed. I'm jamming more people into a smaller space. Each additional hour of labor is going to add less and less to output. So that is the law of diminishing marginal product, or diminishing marginal returns, which is very important in economics, and we saw it in play in our previous example, right? As L increased from, let's say, 16 to 25, the marginal product of labor got smaller, right? It went in this range from 2.22 to, with higher labor, 1.82. So the more labor I add, the less additional output I'm going to get by adding additional labor. All right, so that takes a little while to get used to, but it's a very important question, right? And so what it looks like graphically, so you'll sometimes see this if I plot H and Y, what it means is that my curve kind of flattens out the more H I have. So here, that slope is pretty big, whereas up here, that slope is pretty small, right? For the same change in H, I get a much smaller change in Y. And so that can be really useful, right? So if I compared two countries, and country A has more labor than country B, all else the same, if they each get one more worker, country B's GDP is going to go up by more because they have a higher marginal product, right? So here's country B and here's country A. If I give each one more worker, country B's GDP is going to go up by more because of diminishing marginal product, right? One more worker implies country B's GDP goes up by more. Why? Diminishing marginal product, right? They have less of the resource. Adding more of it is going to increase their GDP by more than in the country that has more of the resource. So you're going to take some practice and really think about this concept of marginal product and diminishing marginal product. Why? It's one of the most central ideas in economics, and we use it a lot. And so getting a hang of that will take you very far in your career in economics. Okay, so that's it for this chapter, right? I have a little thought question at the end. You can read through that and think about it, but that covers the main material for chapter 6.